Thanks, Joe, and thanks so much, Councillor Chandlers. I feel like I don't need to do my presentation now because so much of what I think we're trying to address was in there. What does it mean for us to try and have systems and services that are able to respond to some of the issues that Councillor Chalmers raised there? When we think about the importance of identifying a pattern of coercive control, when we think about how do we respond to the impact of perpetrators' behaviours on the whole family functioning, that it's not an adult to adult issue, that it's actually something that impacts on the child and the family in a really significant way. And I really appreciated this isn't just physical violence, and thinking about what does it mean for coercive control to be in our systems and responses, because often we can focus on physical violence, and just thinking about the fact that this abuse doesn't end after separation, and that often we can focus in on separation or really quite drastic responses that we are expecting survivors to do, which might have quite a detrimental impact on them and their family. So having this approach where we look at what the perpetrator is doing, how does the perpetrator behave after separation, and that it doesn't just end when people separate. So really great, thank you so much. I know that lots of people are familiar with Safe and Together, but I'm going to just talk a bit about the model in Scotland. It's just such a pleasure to talk about for me. I think Scotland's leading the way on this. I think the depth and breadth of what we're doing is leading across the world, to be frank. And I want to talk a bit about why I'm coming to that conclusion. So hopefully you shall see the slides. So I'm going to talk about the model in Scotland, but first I'll just give a bit of a brief introduction to the Safe and Together Institute. I'm Anna Mitchell, I'm the Safe and Together Institute UK lead. And the Safe and Together Institute has a mission to create, nurture and sustain a global network of domestic violence, domestic abuse informed child welfare professionals, communities and systems. And I suppose the thing that's exciting about this for me is the nurturing and sustaining part of that. And that's what this is going to be focusing on, and it's what we are going to be focusing on. What does it mean to nurture and sustain good domestic abuse informed practice, policies, procedures into our systems? So not just a bit of training, but really thinking widely about how we embed and sustain that. And I know we're going to hear from a lot of people in Scotland who are doing just that. I'm not going to spend too long talking about where Safe and Together is, but I suppose it's useful to see that this is a global problem, that some of the issues that we're addressing in Scotland are shared. One of the things I absolutely love about the work that we're doing in Scotland is that we are learning from across the world. We're also learning from other countries in the UK, and some of the work we're doing, like the implementation forum that we hold, is UK wide. And I do actually think it's quite unusual for us to work with people in Ireland, in Wales, in England, to address a problem and learn from each other. And we're certainly doing that wider across the globe as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about what domestic abuse informed practice is and what domestic abuse destructive practice is. And some of the issues that Councillor Chalmers has already raised are really trying to link to some of this. In a nutshell, Safe and Together model is trying to shift our systems from a failure to protect narrative, where survivors, usually mothers, are held responsible for the impact of domestic abuse on their children. And we see that a lot. We see often well-intentioned responses. So, people are worried about adult and child survivors, and sometimes what that can result in is an inadvertent focus on what survivors, mothers are doing, and a push to try and encourage them to do what we think they should be doing to protect their children. And that often falls to leaving the relationship, ending the relationship, leaving home, phoning the police, seeking protective orders. And by doing that, we're not really partnering with survivors around what works for them. about whether any of those things make things better for the family, for their children. And you notice I say better, not safer, because they're not always the same thing. And that often when we have these sort of tick box responses, they're very much focused on survivors and what they're doing, and the perpetrator, usually the father, remains invisible. So we have systems that can focus on singular incidents of physical violence rather than the way that coercive control might impact on the whole family functioning. We have systems that maybe see domestic abuse as an adult-to-adult issue, and we might focus on trauma impact on children when they see it, they hear it, they're in the next room, they're being held, they intervene in an assault. That's when we become really, really worried. And what domestic abuse informed systems are beginning to shift to is the idea that actually we need to be much more able to think about how perpetrators' behaviours impact on all aspects of the family functioning, whether that's trauma impact on the child. It might also be about how the family relates to the world, how they relate to the world when they have to move home or move school, or they lose relationships with family and relatives, and what the impact on the child is from those pathways to harm, right through to whether we see that perpetrators' behaviours impact on the protective parent's ability to parent. One of the most powerful things I heard David Mandel, who created the model, quote from a survivor was, "He stopped me being the mother I wanted to be," is what she said. And are we able to recognise the ways that perpetrators' behaviours actually impact on survivors' ability to parent, on the dreams and wishes that they had for how they want their family to function, on things like routines, stability, how the day-to-day family works, getting to school, getting food, getting hobbies, all of the things that children need. And that children need differently depending on their age and stage of development, depending on their particular issues, on their particular personality, on other things they might be facing. So are we able to be nuanced in our systems to really address these quite complex issues and begin to have a perpetrator pattern-based approach? And what that means is that we hold perpetrators responsible for the impact of domestic abuse on the family. We see them as being 100% responsible for that impact. We see them as making a parenting choice. So perpetrating domestic abuse as a parenting choice, and really thinking about having high standards for fathers, high standards for men as parents, and working in a way that men's parenting choices matter in families. So really focusing on the parenting choices of domestic abuse perpetrators, and that's being a huge part of what we think of as accountability. Domestic abuse informed practice can be defined as a perpetrator patterned, child-centered, survivor strength-based approach to working with domestic abuse. So if we ever need, it's not really a shorthand, it's quite lengthy, but if we ever needed a shorthand of what we mean by that, I think these three kind of themes really help us define what we mean by domestic abuse informed practice and domestic abuse informed systems. And you can see that that really aligns heavily with the Safe and Together model, with Safe and Together principles, keeping the child safe and together with a non-offending parent, that we should be aiming to keep children with their protective parent, and recognise that sometimes our systems create unnecessary barriers between survivors of domestic abuse and the help that we can give them. And anything that we do that creates those unnecessary barriers doesn't help us keep children safe. survivors as a child welfare and protection practice. That actually that's the most child-centred way that we can work. It's not something that's just done by domestic abuse survivor services. It's something that can be done in housing services, in drug and alcohol services, in any service where people come across survivors. We think about how we partner with them to show them that we understand that they're not responsible for their partner's decisions and behaviours, and to show them that we see the things they're doing to be protective, and we want to help them and support them to do those things. And similarly, Principle 3, intervening with the perpetrator to reduce risk and harm to the child, that actually that is not just something that's done in perpetrator services, who probably see a minority of perpetrators when you think of the perpetrators who may be in our wider systems, that actually being able to engage with perpetrators is a skill that people can have, but having a perpetrator pattern-based approach is a skill anyone can have. So even people who don't meet perpetrators can also focus on their behaviours in our conversations, focus on their behaviours when we're speaking to survivors, document perpetrators' patterns, and that those skills help us create accountability in our system. And accountability not just as an offender, but as a domestic abuse perpetrator, as a father. So thinking about accountability being quite wide-ranging, not just perpetration, but also accountable as a parent and a family. So the principles of Safe and Together strongly align with domestic abuse informed practice, and there's certainly very, very widespread use of the model across Scotland. So at the top, we've got just the areas that have done some training. That list gets shorter and shorter because often people who start with some training become our partners. And what that means is that they have a longer term relationship with Safe and Together Institute to think about this leadership, this systems change that we're here to talk about today, and that they host their own certified trainers, and that those trainers are there working long term with both the Institute and their agency to create those domestic abuse informed practitioners and systems. And they do that in a variety of ways. We have a one-day overview, we have core training, which is 4 days long. I mean, I remember when I did my social work qualification, I think we got half a day in domestic abuse training. And really, for an issue that is so prevalent and so cross-cutting, what do we need in our systems to help people train to be able to do this? And what kind of training is it? Is it skills-based? So the core training is very focused on how do we assess, how do we interview, how do we document, and how do we case plan in a domestic abuse informed way. And similarly, supervisor and manager training is something that more and more agencies are looking to do, because good practice needs to be supported by supervisors, managers, and leadership. And we'll talk a bit about that. We also have our partner agencies who have a trainer certification, and that's really the best way to help create some of this systemic change. There's lots of things that's happening in Scotland that's quite unique, that really supports things in a very systemic way, including implementation leads, and you'll be hearing from some of them today. I want to touch on this, and I know it looks a bit complicated, but what this is saying, it's from the Active Implementation Research Network, and it's really saying that in order to create socially significant outcomes, we need to not just think about the innovation. So if we say the innovation is domestic abuse informed practice, we also need to think about how we implement effectively, and we also need to think about enabling context that we're implementing into, and that if any one of these don't exist, then it's not possible to get the outcomes we want. So outcomes relate to the innovation, how we implement it, and also the context we're implementing it into. And what we're going to talk a bit about today is what does it mean to have effective implementation and in an enabling context. What structures and training do we, and policy and leadership do we need for an issue which touches the majority of child deaths, the majority of child protection caseloads, and also interrelates very complicatedly with drugs, alcohol, housing, criminal justice, adult protection? Hugely cross-cutting. What does it mean for us to really acknowledge and think about what structures need to be put in place to create domestic abuse informed systems. And Scotland's really, as I say, been leading the way in this. So institutionalising domestic abuse informed practice is not just about individual workers doing something differently, it's about creating an authorising environment for good practice. And, you know, we've got the only national lead in myself. So we're hoping to have some in Australia and some in North America, but the UK has had an implementation lead from Safe and Together Institute for 3 years now. And similarly, we've got local implementation leads in different areas across Scotland. We have an implementation forum, which is really well attended, where we talk about how to embed the model and learn from each other. And I think really importantly, we've got a multi-agency approach where most of this training is delivered through multi-agency funding and partnerships, and we have certified trainers in the police, in voluntary sector organisations, survivor services, perpetrator programmes, as well as child protection. So a really wide-ranging multi-agency approach in Scotland, which is just excellent. And you can see that in some of the resources and tools that have been developed for the Scottish context. We have ones related to trauma-informed practice, community justice responses and perpetrator programmes, child protection, and drugs and alcohol services. So a huge wide range of ways that it's been embedded in policy in Scotland, which is something that is you know, unique to Scotland, and is something that people across the globe are learning from and seeing. So really exciting. I shall stop there. I had no ability to see the time or what time I was supposed to be on while I was doing that, but hopefully I've not gone over. And I shall hand back to Jo.